Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, a lot of things going on in the Middle East, a lot of things needing to be addressed at this point. I have grave concerns the manner in which this administration is handling the things in the Middle East. Maybe continuing with the policy on international affairs of this administration, which is apparently, from what we see them doing, if you've been an ally to the United States, if you have been our friend, if you have fought with us, if you have had friends and family that fought with us and lost their lives, then this administration's message is we're going to throw you under the bus and we're going to negotiate and help your enemy and our enemy. So it almost looks like the best thing to do for people in the United States that want help from the federal government, move to an island, declare war against the United States, and then this administration will send you all kinds of money and help, buy you an office in Qatar, all kinds of things they're willing to do if you're an enemy. One of the latest things to be occurring this week, we're hearing reports from Egypt after this administration, through an ally with whom agreements had been signed, negotiations continue to be ongoing with Mubarak in Egypt. The man certainly wasn't a teddy bear by any stretch of the imagination, but he had had some success in keeping some semblance of peace with Israel. And yet this administration was quick to tell Mubarak, as our ally, he had to get out, kind of the way that President Carter failed to support another guy that was not a nice man, but the Shah in Iran. And the Carter administration also welcomed the return from exile of a man commonly called the Ayatollah Khomeini. Carter administration welcomed him as a man of peace. As a result of that, Americans have lost lives and will continue to lose lives. There was nothing intentional in that fiasco by the Carter administration. They meant well. They intended good for the country in the Middle East. They just simply didn't know what they were doing. Right now, we're seeing reports this week that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who has certainly made clear from their actions they're not our friends. They are certainly not a friend of Israel. They've been making noise for some time that they did not intend to recognize Israel. They did not want to keep the peace treaty with Israel. And in fact, there's an article from February 14th of 2011 by Dean Reynolds from CBS Interactive that points out that Egypt's influential Muslim Brotherhood, this was supposedly before the Arab Spring even, never supported the Camp David Accords, and a leading secular politician, Aman Noor, says they should be renegotiated. So the people that this administration has been so out front and welcoming, sending people over there, well, those that have been able to get out and come back, that aren't being held by this obviously anti-American government that has taken shape, are indicating, at least those in the administration, gee, we got to send a bunch of money to Egypt. We're going to try to buy them off and buy their allegiance. I've been saying for many years now, every term since I've been here, something that should be clear to all Americans. when it comes to all this money that we throw at people around the world that hate our guts, that want to see the United States brought down, places where they laughed when 3,000 Americans were killed on 9/11. We're sending them money. And the thing I've been saying ever since I got to Congress is you don't have to pay people to hate you. They will do it for free. I've had a UN voting accountability bill that I've filed in each Congress. Got over 100 votes at one point. And hopefully that will continue to grow. The bill is very simple. And it follows the adage that I've been saying for all these years. You don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. So the bill is very, very simple. Any nation that votes against the United States position in the UN more than 50% of the time would get no money, no assistance of any kind from the United States. These countries are autonomous. They're independent. They're free to make whatever decisions they wish. But if they are going to be anti-American and be against all of the human rights positions that we hold dear, whether it's for religion or gender, as we see women's rights being abused so badly around the world in countries we're pouring in money, as we see in areas in the world where we have poured in hundreds of billions of dollars, and yet they are doing all they can to eliminate churches. Some have been successful. To persecute Christians and Jews, and yet we continue to pour in money. Well, since we've seen the position of this administration being anti-religious here in recent days, it's starting to come together and make more sense that this administration is simply being consistent. We admire consistency, but when they want to send money to countries that persecute Christians and persecute those who want to worship freely, I guess that's consistent with what has been done in the President's Obamacare bill and the latest pronouncement that Catholics just needed to set aside their religious beliefs because they were inconsistent with what the President wanted done. Let's see, we've got an article here from February 18th of 2011. This says, the headline from Reuters, peace treaty with Israel is up to the Egyptian people. This was a year ago. The spokesman for Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood responds to U.S. National Intelligence Director, who said he had assumed Brotherhood was not in favor of maintaining the peace treaty with Israel. Well, that's a nice thing for this administration to plant in the head of the Egyptians, the Muslim Brotherhood taking control in Egypt, that, gee, we kind of just assumed you wouldn't want to support the treaty with Israel. Well, that allowed the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood to say, you know what, gee, we thought you were going to be upset with us if we didn't support the treaty with Israel, but thanks for letting us know that your assumption would be that when you helped us take over that, you know, we wouldn't support Israel being there. Great move, great move. But that was Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. He said, quote, I would assess that they, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, are not in favor of the treaty, unquote. What kind of diplomatic fiasco is that? We go to September 12, 2011. Headline, this September 12, 2011 article, one day past the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. Headline, Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt-Israel peace treaty needs to be reviewed. The subtitle, Muslim Brotherhood tells regional Al-Sharq Oswald Daily Peace Treaty is of great importance. It says Israel generally does not honor the agreement. And then they quote Mahmoud Hussein, the group's Secretary General, as saying that, like other agreements, this one needs to be reviewed and is in the hands of the Parliament. There are others in which they called, some in Egypt, in a position of power, have called for the complete elimination of any agreement with Israel. There are those who have said, well, let's put it up to a national vote, and since the Muslim Brotherhood is all about Israel no longer existing, and since the Muslim Brotherhood has taken a majority, a slim majority, but a majority in the government there in Egypt, then it would seem that it's likely their position would prevail. So all of those years, the one crowning glory that the Carter administration could point to, the Camp David Accords, this administration has even thrown the Carter administration under the bus, just like they have some of our allies, like the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, like those who were loyal to Americans in Iraq, like the Kurds in many ways in northern Iraq, like Israel, for example, in the manner of which we've treated them publicly. It was May 2 years ago that this administration did what some thought was unthinkable that this administration or any administration would ever do. They voted with all of Israel's enemies in slapping Israel, demanding they disclose their weaponry, particularly nuclear weapons, if any that they have. We'd never done that before. And for those that bother to look in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament to some of us, and you read the account of Hezekiah welcoming leaders from Babylon, and Isaiah was sent to Hezekiah and was asked, and he knew the answer, but he asked Hezekiah, what have you done? And in essence, Hezekiah, king of Israel, said, well, these wonderful leaders, of course this is Texas paraphrase, but these wonderful leaders came over from Babylon, and so I showed them all our treasure, and I showed them all our defenses, our armaments. And in essence, Isaiah basically said, you fool, because you've done this, you'll lose the country. Now, it's been hard for some administrations who took the position that, gee, if you're just completely open, as Hezekiah was, about our defenses and what all we have, you bring people on, let them review your nuclear submarines, let them see the abilities we have for attack. You bring them into our military bases and show them how we operate, show them our tactics, that they'll just all of a sudden fall in love with us, and it'll make us stronger. The lesson throughout history, including the one Hezekiah and his sons had to learn the long way, the hard way rather, is you don't show your enemies all your defenses. You don't climb in to political relationships with those who want to destroy you, with those who want to destroy your best friends. It's not a good message. Al-Qaeda, here's an article from Fox News, Al-Qaeda on the rise in Syria has a marriage of convenience with Iran, U.S. intelligence director says. Well, I would think that was pretty obvious. I'm glad someone with our intelligence department has been able to figure that out. Hopefully they'll be able to figure that out with regard to Lebanon. Hopefully our intelligence department will be able to figure out with regard to Iraq, that the leader in Iraq who has shown hostility to this government and people in this government to the point that when 5 of us were over there, bipartisan group, and we had a couple of questions that Maliki did not particularly appreciate. One about, hey, you know, there were people that were assuring us back in 2001, 2002, 2003 that if we came and got rid of this terrible dictator that hated the United States named Saddam Hussein, that's because Iraq was so oil rich that once we were able to turn the country back over to the Iraqi people after wresting it away from a totalitarian dictator who killed and abused, tortured Iraqi citizens, that Iraq would be so grateful once the oil got to flowing that they would help ameliorate some of the vast amount of treasure that Americans spent to allow them to elect their own leaders, to allow them to elect a leader like Maliki. Well, he was deeply offended, it appeared, as he was when I brought up Camp Ashraf and the maltreatment, in fact the killing of residents of Camp Ashraf who were Iranian refugees. But the concern was the United States had promised the residents of Camp Ashraf, the Iranian refugees in Iraq, that we would make sure they were protected. And when Maliki's government took over from us, he himself promised Camp Ashraf residents that he and his government would make sure they were safe. Maliki promised the United States that he would keep them safe. And yet, apparently, the pressure from Iran and the fear that Iran has instilled in the leadership, particularly Maliki, in Iraq is so profound that since he knew President Obama had made clear we were pulling out completely, we weren't going to be around to protect them, to help them, we were getting out completely. We were not going to be around to make sure that our investment of American lives and treasure was not wasted. We were pulling out, leaving everything to him, going to leave everything to chance, despite the investment. Maliki showed no gratitude, in fact, hostility. And in fact, when our group of 5 bipartisan members of Congress were on the way flying out on one of the luxurious C-130s, I am prone to sarcasm, the C-130s are no, they're no better than they were when I was in the Army 30 years ago. You know, you're sitting on web seating, just like the paratroopers used back then, still use. The back end opens down. Same C-130s. We're flying out, and we got word by radio that Maliki's government had told us that our group of 5 members of Congress were no longer welcome in his country. The man seems to have thrown in with Iran, and I hope before long. I know we have some brilliant intelligence officers. I've interacted with some of our intelligence community. I'm quite impressed with the intelligence of many of our intelligence officers, and I'm hopeful that the intelligence at the lower levels of our intelligence agencies will eventually affect those in top positions in our intelligence agencies, and so they will begin to realize what others have known for a very long time. In Afghanistan, I understand President Karzai is not terribly pleased with the position that some of us have taken, but some of us are not terribly pleased with the positions of the Karzai government in throwing in, well, at least accommodating the Taliban, accommodating those who are supplying the Taliban, accommodating those who are supplying the Taliban and the Taliban itself as they continue to plot and kill Americans. But in fairness to President Karzai, when you look at his situation, President Obama has made clear the United States is completely getting out of Afghanistan. And we're going to leave them just as we did Iraq, just as the Democratic Congress demanded in 1974 from Vietnam. We were going to leave our allies, those who had fought with us and assisted us, lost family, friends, treasure, to support our position because they were enemies of our enemy. This administration was going to leave them high and dry. And this administration's already shown in Iraq that's what happens. So from President Karzai's position, he's got to be sitting there going, they're about to leave. The Taliban has gotten stronger and stronger with Pakistan's supplying and assisting them. The United States government will not be here to protect me. Gee, maybe I better start being nicer to the Taliban and the radical elements in the Pakistan government, because that's who's going to determine whether I stay in power or not. Found out in a meeting with some Afghan officials from the Northern Alliance, and then I've done subsequent research since. The government of Afghanistan has about a $12.5 billion budget, and they themselves collect enough revenue, taxes and whatnot in Afghanistan that they're able to supply about $1.5 billion of their $12.5 billion budget. The rest comes from other countries, and most of that is from the United States. It was interesting traveling around Afghanistan before New Year's, after New Year's, going to forward operating bases, talking to some of our troops. We've got some terrific folks on the ground over there, but there is a problem. Those of us who majored in history know, those of us who have bothered to read any history learn, that is a tough area in which to be an occupier as a foreign country. Foreign countries occupying or trying to occupy in Afghanistan don't do very well. It's not a place we ought to be occupying. So I hear some, like some in this administration, sounds like they're throwing up their hands saying, well, let's just get out and let happen whatever's going to happen. Because they know occupying forces don't do well. They're right about that. But by simply withdrawing without using some intelligence and some lessons from history means we may have to fight the Taliban again. And it may again be after massive loss of American lives, and perhaps the next time it will be when they're armed with nuclear weapons where they can kill hundreds of thousands instead of thousands. Of course, if you read the communications that were intercepted about 9/11, they were hopeful there for a while that there were maybe 50,000 people in the Twin Towers that were going to be killed, they hoped were killed, when the planes crashed into the Twin Towers in New York City. They didn't care about innocent American lives or all those foreign visiting folks that were in the Twin Towers. They could care less. They wanted to make a point, and make a point by killing tens of thousands. Well, with the inappropriate strategy of this government, of this administration, the Obama administration, we could end up having this nation pay a far greater price than has even been paid to date. Unfortunately, there are consequences for bad decisions. It is important that we select proper leadership in this country. Anybody that reads through the book of Hosea finds a verse, and I've never had it jump out as it did until a few weeks ago. And there are different translations, but I like the translation in which the communication from God to Hosea was, he was angry with the people of Israel because he said they had chosen leaders who were not God's choice. There needs to be a lot more praying in this country as we select our leaders, as we select our national leaders for president and for his administration, for those who are elected to Congress, for those who are elected to the Senate, for those who are elected in state and local elections, and a lesson for us in Congress, that we elect within Congress the proper leaders. Because, as the founders believed, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. 1/3 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were not just Christians, they were ordained ministers. One of them has a translation of the Bible, one of the signers of the Declaration, still can be found in print today. These people understood the lessons from history, and they did not want to make those mistakes. Here we have February 13th, an article by Patrick Goodenow entitled, Hamas Leader Promises Iran Never to Recognize Israel. Now, we've had some in this country, in this administration, who have indicated, privately they say, we don't really have to worry. Sunnis and Shias hate each other. They're never going to come together. So that can help keep one from getting too much power because there is that conflict. Well, because in small part, that small part is growing to larger part due to some of the actions and inactions of this administration, Shias and Sunnis are coming together. And so here you have a Hamas Gaza leader, Ismail Haniyeh, delivering a speech at a rally in Tehran, Iran, last Saturday, marking the 33rd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, and he's speaking, and behind him are the portraits of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini and his predecessor Ayatollah Khomeini. And here he is in the Gaza Strip as a leader of the terrorist organization Hamas, and he's speaking on behalf of Iranian leaders. We are bringing Shia and Sunni together like people 10 years ago would never have believed possible by the ineptitude of what's happening in this administration. But the article points out, amid growing speculation of a split within the top ranks of Hamas, Iranian leaders at the weekend urged the terrorist group's Gaza leader to continue its campaign of violent resistance and pledged continuing financial support. This from a terrorist group of leaders. They're pledging to support the terrorist Hamas leaders in the Gaza Strip. And the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini told the Gaza Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, people do not expect anything except endurance from Palestine's resistance. It's time to wake up to what's going on with this administration and their help for groups that hate America, that hate Israel. Here's an article from February 12th who says Brotherhood lawmaker says USA to Cairo assured. Well, isn't that special? He's gotten an assurance from this administration, as he told Al Hayat, that if the U.S. cut aid to Egypt, it would be a violation of the 1979 peace accords. they've indicated they're not interested in keeping the 1979 peace accord. Yes. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
Gentleman from Texas may proceed. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you. Always glad to get messages from the President of the United States, and we hope this will be a helpful one. Here's an article from February 13. Muslim Brotherhood warns U.S. aid cut may affect Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. But apparently they're getting assurances, hey, we're going to make sure you keep getting money from us. You hate our guts, you hate Israel, you want Israel gone, so, you know, hey, we're going to keep supporting you. And in fact, another article, February 13th of this year, headline reads, Obama proposes $800 million in aid for, quote, Arab Spring, unquote. Well, we've seen what the Arab Spring has done. If you were a Christian while Mubarak was in power, there was some persecution, and it wasn't pretty. But now, all semblance of any efforts to allow Christians to worship freely in Egypt is gone. We saw a headline last year that the last public Christian church in Afghanistan had to be closed. We continue to pour in aid. Here's a February 8, 2012 headline, Pentagon counters dim assessment of Afghan war. Then there's another article, the Afghanistan report the Pentagon doesn't want you to read, by Michael Hastings. There's one by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, Truth Lies in Afghanistan, How Military Leaders Have Let Us Down. Here's one from February 10th of this year, 2012, Roads to Nowhere, Program to Win Over Afghans Fails. In talking to some of our troops in forward positions in Afghanistan, some were a bit down, particularly those who have been training Afghans to farm, because we are sending around $3 billion for nothing but projects in Afghanistan, including these type of farming projects, so the people can make their own way. And yet we were told they're training the Afghans, they've been training the Afghans, but the billions of dollars the United States government, the Obama administration, has sent to Afghanistan to help them develop farming projects, at least in this one region, has never gotten past the corrupt regional government. So the projects where they could use these farming skills that are being taught don't exist. And they're not anticipated to exist. We set up a corrupt government in Afghanistan. And I don't know how honest anybody in the Karzai regime was before they got there, but there should be a lesson that can be learned from King David, the only person mentioned in the Bible to have had a heart after God's own, that when there is no accountability, even the best among us can do terrible things. So when you set up a government in Afghanistan, and we, the United States, supported their Constitution that said Sharia law rule, which meant there were not going to be any more Christian churches in Afghanistan, and now they're not publicly. And Jews have had to flee from Afghanistan. Last report I read said there was one publicly acknowledged Jew in Afghanistan. With all the blood and treasure we shed to eliminate the Taliban's now come back. And now this administration has announced to the world and to the Taliban, look, we'll release all the people that we have in detention that have murdered American troops. we'll let them come back. They can keep murdering when we let them go. We'll even buy you a wonderful office in Qatar if you'll just come talk to us. That is the kind of proposals that everybody's heard, and that's what has allowed Taliban leaders, as one of them did in Afghanistan earlier this month, announce to all of Afghanistan and their largest television station that, look, we're about to be in charge as soon as the American government leaves. So here's the deal. The American government is telling, they basically acknowledged we've whipped them, they've lost, so they're doing everything they can to get us to come negotiate. So here's the situation. If you have not been totally supportive of the Taliban here in Afghanistan, they say, then it's time to come to us, ask forgiveness, and ask for our providing safety for you. Because if you don't, when we take over, as soon as the U.S. pulls out, you know, you're in trouble. And the result could be the death penalty. So, do we have another announcement? Yes.
The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been informed by the Senate that the Senate has agreed to the conference report accompany H.R. 3630, an act to provide incentives for the creation of jobs and for other purposes.
Gentleman from Texas may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a way around totally abandoning the investment we had for a peaceful Afghanistan without a powerful Taliban. It's common sense. You see it throughout history. What you do is support friends who are enemies of your enemy. The Taliban is our enemy. We know that the Taliban can be defeated because they were, when we had less than 1,500 American troops in Afghanistan, special ops guys, incredibly trained, and some of our best intelligence officers over there from our intelligence agencies, obviously not top intelligence officials, because these guys were really competent, and they whipped the Taliban, had them completely on the run, and then we kind of took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, started looking at Iraq. And the Taliban has made a resurgence. And they've become powerful again in Afghanistan. And in meeting with leaders from the Northern Alliance, even though Secretary Clinton and former Secretary Albright did what they could to keep us from meeting, because apparently when this administration throws our allies under a bus, this administration wants them to stay under the bus. Some of us believe if somebody has been our ally, has helped fight our enemy, then they need to remain our friends. These are Muslims. These are our friends. And their enemy is our enemy. And I'm told by some of the American military leaders that Northern Alliance has plenty of weapons, but they don't have all the weapons they had when they defeated the Taliban before. We do not have to stay in Afghanistan. But if we do not want to have to come back and fight the Taliban again, the thing to do is rearm and re-empower the enemy of our enemies. Afghanistan has never been a strong and never had a strong central government. What made us, in our arrogance, think we could force a strong centralized government that would work in that country? It is a very tribal nation. In the northern area, this administration wants to call our allies, our former allies, warlords, war criminals, blood on their hands. They were fighting for us and with us. So in this administration's effort to manipulate the U.S. media, they leak all kinds of stories about how terrible our allies were. They're fighting terrible people. They're fighting people who were training others to come kill thousands and thousands of Americans. These are not nice people, and war is not a pleasant thing. The Northern Alliance leaders had two asks. One, help us get a constitution amended so that we get to elect our regional leaders. Each province in Afghanistan should be able to elect their local governors. Each province should be able to elect the mayors of the towns within that province. Let them select their own police chief. Let them do as the United States came together to do, not so much in 1983 with Articles of Confederation, but in 1987 with our U.S. Constitution that allowed people to elect local government officials, state government officials, and national officials. We have a constitution that's been set up in Afghanistan that basically lets the Karzai administration appoint the regional governors, the mayors, they select the police chiefs. That is a system fraught with corruption. No matter how honest anybody was going in, including President Karzai, how in the world could you stay honest and above corruption when you have set up a system that lends itself to corruption? Well, that's what's happening. So it doesn't seem so much to ask. Let the Northern Alliance, as every other area of Afghanistan, elect their local leaders, elect their governors, and then those regional areas become strong again. And then just as states fuss when the federal government of the United States tries to get too powerful, as we've seen with Obamacare, let's empower those regional, provincial governments in Afghanistan to be powerful enough to call down their national leaders when they are corrupt. Let's empower them to fix their own problems, and you don't have to have massive numbers of American troops to do that, but you do have to be smart in the way you deal with a country that has lots of your enemies that want to kill you. So, they ask, let us elect our local regional leaders, give us enough equipment where we can defeat the Taliban again for you and for us. Now, in meeting and talking to people in Afghanistan, they knew, as did the Baluch leaders in southern Pakistan, that the Taliban is being supplied and equipped with armaments, IEDs that are dismembering and killing our soldiers in Afghanistan, are being supplied through the southern area of Pakistan. This is an area of Pakistan that wasn't Pakistan until 1948, when international leaders arbitrarily took pencils and just drew boundary lines, and they included most of Baluchistan in with Pakistan. The Baluchis did not want to be there. They have a very mineral-rich area that is supplying Pakistan with most of their minerals, and yet the Pakistan government is so badly mistreating the Baluch people. They raid, they torture, they terrorize the Baluch people in southern Pakistan. And if Pakistan is going to so terribly mistreat our Muslim friends in southern Pakistan, in the Baluch area, the Baluchistan area of Pakistan, then it's time to push for an independent Baluchistan that will be a nation of Muslim friends of the United States. And we will remain their friends because their enemy is our enemy. And we won't have to sacrifice American troops, American lives, and massive amounts of American treasure like we've been doing. You simply empower the enemy of our enemy and let them do the work for us. That is the solution. That would be in keeping with holding dear the American lives that have been lost in fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. That would be true to our beliefs and our desire only to fight those who want to destroy what we are and who we are. That would truly honor those who have given so much in honor of this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I have a friend, Mr. Mo Brooks, here. I would like to yield back so Mr. Brooks can be recognized.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the Majority Leader. The gentleman has 15 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the House today, H.R. 3630, the so-called payroll tax holiday, passed. Later, it passed the United States Senate, meaning it passed the United States Congress. But on the House floor today, I joined 91 other Republican budget hawks, each of whom shares my concern for the financial stability of our nation and a risk of a federal government insolvency and bankruptcy. Each of us, budget hawks, voted no. In December 2011, Alabama Senators Richard Shelby and Jeff Sessions and I voted no on the deceptively named payroll tax bill. I am pleased today that I was part of a united Republican delegation from the state of Alabama to vote no on H.R. 3630. Robert Adderholt, Republican from Haleyville, voted no. Spencer Backus, Republican from Birmingham, voted no. Mike Rogers, Republican from Anniston, voted no. Martha Roby, Republican from Montgomery, voted no. Joe Bonner, Republican from Mobile, voted no. On the Senate side, Alabama Senator Richard Shelby voted no. Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions voted no. Each of these individual congressmen and senators voted no, again, because they share a deep-rooted concern for the financial stability of our country and the impact this legislation can have on that. In sum, I voted against H.R. 3630 for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to mention three. First, H.R. 3630 disproportionately targets and burdens American federal workers, takes their hard-earned money, and diverts it to those who don't work for it. That's not fair. That's not good policy. Second, America's seniors have asked me to protect Social Security and Medicare benefits because they paid for and earned them during their working lifetimes. Americans support Social Security because everyone contributes their fair share to their own Social Security retirement benefits. Social Security is not welfare. Social Security is an earned entitlement. H.R. 3630 undermines Social Security's and Medicare's foundation by threatening 10% funding cuts totaling $120 billion per year, which will, if continued beyond this fiscal year, breach America's commitment to our elderly and will force significant Social Security and Medicare benefit cuts. We cannot expect the benefits while cutting the revenue that provides those benefits. Third, and most importantly, the name middle-class tax relief, which is on the title of H.R. 3630, is deceptive and it is false. There is no tax cut. Rather, Mr. Speaker, I want the American people to understand that it is 100% a loan. Let me delve into that in a little bit deeper. But as I do so, let me mention this. In the private sector, if a commercial institution had done what Congress did today, it would constitute flagrant violations of truth in advertising, truth in lending, and deceptive practices statutes. But as we all know, Washington is all too often immune from such constraints. H.R. 3630 is false advertising and deceptive because it is not a tax cut. H.R. 3630 is a loan that risks America's solvency, in which the American people must pay back with interest. In this regard, the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation reports reveal two troubling aspects of H.R. 3630. First, according to the CBO's and JCT's estimates, enacting H.R. 3630 would change revenues and direct spending to produce increases in the deficit of $101.1 billion in fiscal year 2012. $101.1 billion in fiscal year 2012, and we're already 4 or 5 months through with this fiscal year. So that gives you an idea of what it's like for the remainder. Further, H.R. 3630 would direct the Office of Management and Budget to exclude the budgetary effects of H.R. 3630 from its scorecard of balances under the statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. So what is H.R. 3630 doing? Well, it's instructing the Office of Management and Budget to not count the deficit impact of this legislation on its full scorecard of balances. In sum, the Congressional Budget Office report confirms that every penny of so-called tax cut must be paid back with interest. Now, where I come from, if you're giving money that you have to pay back with interest, that is called a loan. And that is exactly what the American people will have to do. My parents taught me about debt. Debt never rests. Debt is working against you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for however many years it takes you to pay it off in full. Too much debt enslaves you. Your creditors and your debt become your masters. You become their servant. This is what debt does to every American family, and it is doing that slowly but surely to America. As you all know, we blew through the $15 trillion debt mark in November of 2011, and sometime this year we're going to blow by the $16 trillion debt mark. That debt is not free. There is no free lunch. According to the CBO report, H.R. 3630 racks up debt at the rate of over $12 billion per month in FY 2012. Now, if I'd had a printed copy of H.R. 3630, but you know the speed of this place sometimes does not empower you to have that. According to the CBO report, if we were to have printed H.R. 3630 on sheets of gold, which we probably should have, because it cost American taxpayers roughly $500 million per page in additional debt burden and payments. That's the cost of that bill per page. Why would Washington do this to America? What is Washington's motive for this deception? Why don't we call things what they are? Why do we call a payroll tax rather than a Social Security and Medicare funding tax, which is what it really is? The answer is simple. Poll data, pandering to voters in the 2012 elections. Why does Washington use the phrase payroll tax rather than what so-called payroll taxes are, Social Security and Medicare funding taxes? Because polls show voters don't understand what the payroll tax is, but by golly, they know what Social Security and Medicare funding taxes are. Yet 100% of the so-called tax cuts in H.R. 3630 are cuts to Social Security and Medicare funding taxes. In other words, Washington politicians use the phrase payroll tax because they know using the more accurate phrase Social Security tax would cause American voters to rise up to protect our Social Security and Medicare system. Worse yet, H.R. 3630 deceives America's working families into believing they are reaping a windfall when, in fact, they are being saddled with a burden that will hamstring our children, grandchildren, and America's future with another layer of heavy, taxing, onerous debt. What Washington won't tell the American people is that H.R. 3630 is another debt-busting bill that further empowers China and other American creditors to become our master, while enslaving America and the American people with generations of oppressive debt-burdened payments. Mr. Speaker, America yearns for leadership, leadership that involves adult, mature conversations with American voters about the financial condition we are in and what H.R. 3630 is really about. There are simply too many in Washington who pander to voters in an election year for political gain. H.R. 3630, Mr. Speaker, I would submit represents the worst of Washington, not the best, and not what the people deserve. I cannot speak for other congressmen, but as for me, today, I and 90 other Republican budget hawks stood strong for America's future. We voted to kill H.R. 3630, stop the deception, stop pandering to voters, and save America from another mountain of oppressive debt that threatens us with insolvency and bankruptcy. Mr. Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Bartlett, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I looked at the television this morning and that little crawler across the top of one of our stations, I noticed that oil was $103 a barrel. $103 a barrel, and we're in a recession. What's happening here? And so I've got a chart here that goes back a few years. In fact, it ends in, 2008. And there we have oil at something less than $100 a barrel, but if you extended this chart out just a little bit, you would see that it would have jumped up to $147 a barrel, and that's, of course, aided by the housing bubble collapse. The economy came tumbling down, and the price of oil dropped down to something down to about here, under $40 a barrel, and now it's crept back up slowly, as supply was not able to keep up with demand until we now have oil at $103 a barrel, and we're in a recession. This is an interesting chart because it was maybe predicting something that we were sure was going to happen at some time or other, but we weren't sure when it was going to happen, and that's a phenomenon called peak oil. Peak oil is that highest production that you can achieve for a country. It occurs in a country, it occurs in a region, it occurs in the world. That peak for us occurred in 1970. And today, in spite of all that we have done in the most creative, innovative society in the world, the United States, today we produce half the oil that we did in 1970, and we've drilled more oil wells in our country than all the rest of the world put together. Well, here we see that the two entities which do a really good job of tracking the production and consumption, which are the same. We don't have any big stores anywhere of oil, so the consumption is the same thing as the production of oil. And they looked like they'd plateaued. They'd been going up and up and up every time we needed more oil. We could produce more oil, but we ran out of our ability to do that, and as the production stagnated and the demand kept going up, wow, look what happened to the price. A really spike in the price there, and it went up to $147 a barrel. We weren't sure then that this might not have been just a little ripple in the upswing of production of oil, but we now know that it wasn't, that this the caption up there is right. Peak oil, are we there yet? Apparently so, as you'll see subsequently. This is an interesting chart and a very new one. This is produced by Deutsche Bank and their economists there. And it's looking now not at the production of oil, but at the rate of increase. And the little left-hand bar here I think is quite optimistic. I hope that that happens. I doubt that that will happen, as we will see in a few moments. But they're looking at an increase in production of about 5 billion barrels today. The world's been stuck now for 5 years at 84 million barrels of oil a day. And this looks at increasing that production by 5 million. This is capacity, by the way. This is capacity at any price. This is how much more you could produce no matter what the price was. Obviously, you can produce more oil if it's $200 a barrel because you can develop fields that you can't develop at $100 a barrel, and you'll produce more oil if people are willing to pay $7 a gallon for their gas rather than $3.80 a gallon for their gas. So this is their optimistic projection of what capacity increase could be, and this is a reality of what demand will be. And this is the increase in demand, not total demand, because we still are the biggest consumers of energy in the world, but our demand rate is not going up. As a matter of fact, it's fallen off a bit. We used to import 21 million barrels a day. That's a fourth of the world's oil. Now we're importing, I think, about 18.5 million barrels a day. That's nice that we became more efficient because the Chinese in their economic growth needed more oil, and the fact that we're using less made more available to them because they're increasing about 6% a year in their use of oil. Well, what this shows is that there's a 20% deficit here. This is capacity at any price. If we went, full board, just producing oil everywhere we could produce it, their prognostication is that by 2015, we're going to have a 20% shortfall in supply, even if we maximize capacity by having very high prices for oil. Now, the next chart will show you why I think that this is maybe an optimistic assumption of what will happen. Let me show you this chart. There are two charts here, and the first one of these, the top one, appeared in 08. The bottom one appeared in 10. And this is the International Energy Agency. It's the World Energy Outlook. This is a creature of the OECD in Europe. We have a kindred organization, the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, which is a part of our Department of Energy, and I don't have them with me, but they have very similar charts that are saying essentially the same thing. The top chart they had on their website in 08, and let's take a look at that. It's really a very interesting chart. This bottom dark blue here, if the chart was very long and went way over to the far wall over there back when 100 years ago when we started using oil, it would have started at 0. And every time we needed more oil, we could pump more oil, and so it just kept rising and rising and rising. And now here we are at a total liquid fuels of 84 million barrels a day. Not all of that is usable in your gas tank. The top one here is natural gas liquids. That will increase. We found a lot more natural gas. The prices dropped now to about $3. The green one here, which is small now and projected to grow, and that will grow, that's unconventional oil. That's oil that you get from things like the tar sands in Alberta, Canada. But as you notice here, they're predicting a fairly precipitous drop-off in production from the fields that we're now pumping. This is crude oil currently producing fields. Up until now, every time we've needed more oil from those fields, all we had to do was to suck a little harder in the wells and the oil came up. And what they're predicting here is that that won't be true for the future, that the world is now going to experience the situation that the United States has been in since 1970. That is, no matter what you do, production of oil will drop off from the fields that you are now pumping. The dark red here is enhanced oil recovery. That really should be a part of the bottom one here because it's just squeezing a little bit more oil out of the fields you're presently pumping by putting live steam down there or CO2 down there or seawater. And Saudi Arabia uses a lot of seawater to force their oil out. It's easily separated after you got it to the surface. Now, they're predicting that by 2030, on this chart, that we'll be producing 106 million barrels of oil a day, up from the 84 million barrels of oil that we are producing today. And in order to do that, with the production dropping off from the fields that we are pumping now, we're going to have to get oil somewhere else. And there are two somewhere else's that they're talking about. One of those is this light blue, and that's developing fields that we have now discovered, which are too difficult and expensive to develop, even with oil at $100 a barrel, like a big find in the Gulf of Mexico that was under 7,000 feet of water and 30,000 feet of rock. But at some price, and I heard $111 a barrel, that sounds pretty precise, that $111 a barrel they could begin developing that field. And then the red here, the bright red, is fields yet to be discovered. These are fields we haven't discovered yet, but we will discover them. And they're projecting that we'll be able to develop those fields. And so we have these two big wedges in here that will keep the production of oil going up from the 84 million barrels a day now for liquid fuels to 106 million barrels a day in 2030. Now, 2 years later, the same organization did another prognostication, and that's the one on the bottom here. And this time they go out to 2035 instead of 2030. They go out 5 years further. And now they have reduced their expectations from 106 million barrels of oil a day to just 96 million barrels of oil a day. As they look at the prospects out there, they are persuaded that we're not going to be able to reach that 106 million barrels a day. So now they're prognosticating 5 years later only 96 million barrels a day. The top two curves here are exactly the same thing. They've flipped them and they've changed the colors. The top one here now is unconventional oil, and the second one is natural gas liquids. And notice here that even taking the enhanced oil recovery and putting that little wedge down here with the production from the fields currently producing, they have a really precipitous fall off. They're looking at those 2 years later, they look at them and wow, they are really decreasing in production faster than we thought they were, so we're going to have even less oil than we thought we would have. So now they have two huge wedges. And if you look at this line, this heavy dark line here, that's the liquid fuels that can go in your gas tank, and that's barely moving up, is it? It's just about flat there. And they keep it flat by having these two wedges that are really, really large. By 2035, what, to 3/4 of all the liquid fuels that we're producing are going to come from fields that we're producing nothing from now. Now, I want to go back to the previous chart where they had this prognostication about the growth of 5 billion barrels a day by 15. This goes clear out to 35, and they're only up to 96. But we need to note that that was capacity no matter what the cost. And that may be true. That may be true that you could get there. But, you know, we'd not like to see oil at $200 a barrel, would we? Our economy would not respond very well to that. By the way, if you go on their website, you may have difficulty finding the lower chart. Some have told me that it's not there at all, and you won't find the upper chart. It's a little embarrassing to have these two charts side by side showing how much your predictions changed in just 2 years from 08 to 10. The next chart kind of puts this in perspective of the world, and this is a very interesting chart. And it's one that, you know, the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and boy, this says it, doesn't it? This is the world according to oil. And this is what the world would look like if the square miles of terrain on a country was equal to the amount of oil they had. What would the world look like? And you see here that Saudi Arabia is dominating the world. They have 22% of all the reserves in the world. We aren't really sure that's what they have. That's what they tell us they have. But, you know, they won't open their books. None of these OPEC countries, and you see they have the lion's share of all the oil reserves, none of them will open their books. And we don't really know for sure how much oil is there, but we do know that they're still pumping large amounts of oil, and that's what they say they have, and so that's what the chart here depicts. I want to take just a moment to commend our military. They're taking some flack recently for what they're doing. I think that they're doing exactly the right thing for several different reasons. They're moving as quickly as they can from fossil fuels, from oil to alternatives. And they're doing that for a couple of very good reasons. One is if you can avoid transporting that oil, if you can somehow create the alternatives nearer to where you are using them, you will avoid a huge cost in both treasure and lives, because a significant number of the people killed in these wars are killed in the convoys that are bringing fuel. Understand that the weight of the fuel that they bring is about 70% of everything they haul to the war front is fuel. Reminds me a little, I understand that in the canal boats on the C&O Canal, that about 70% of what they carried was food for the mules, and so it hasn't changed a lot, has it? We still, this energy source is about 70% of all the weight that we carry. So I want to take just a moment to commend our military for doing exactly the right thing. They are really forward-looking. For the moment, you know, you may pay a little more for the alternatives, but, you know, since the liquid fuels from conventional sources just aren't going to be there in the future without something happening that almost nobody who's knowledgeable in this field thinks will happen. They're doing exactly the right thing, and I want to commend them for what they are doing. They're recognizing that the world will inevitably transition from fossil fuels to renewables. The first person that articulated that, although it would seem that anybody would understand that since the moon isn't made of green cheese and the earth isn't made of oil, that the fossil fuels are finite and one day they will be gone. But the first person that I know of who really recognized that, a prominent person, was Hyman Rickover, who made the statement, in the 8,000-year recorded history of man, the age of oil would be but a blip. He had no idea how long it would last, but he said that how long it lasted was important in only one regard. The longer it lasted, the more time would we have to plan an orderly transition to alternative sources of energy. And our military is doing exactly that. And they are not totally understood by everybody, and I just wanted to commend them for their foresight and their tenacity in pursuing these programs. Let's just spend a couple more moments with this chart because it is so meaningful. Here we are, the United States. We're this yellow color because we use a lot of oil per capita, and we're that size because that's all the oil we have. We represent reserves of about 2% of the reserves in the world, and we use 25%, maybe a whisker less than that now, of oil in the world. And we import about 2/3 of what we use. Our number one importer, by the way, is Canada, and they have less oil than we, but they don't have very many people, so they can export. And the number two importer was Mexico, but now they have fallen to number 3, and Saudi Arabia is now our number 2 importer. A very interesting experience in Mexico. A fisherman by the name of Cantarell kept bringing his nets into the National Oil Company saying, your spilled oil messed up my fishing net, you need to give me a new one. And Pemex is a national company, and so they would give him a new net. He kept bringing them in. They said, gee, we didn't think we spilled that much oil. Where are you finding this oil? So he said, come, I will show you. And it was kind of bubbling up out of the ocean, and they drilled there, and for a number of years, they had the second largest field in the world in terms of production. Second only to Garwar, which is the granddaddy of all fields. It's been pumping now for half a century in Saudi Arabia, and I still think it pumps something like 5 million barrels a day, which is about what we pump from our country, and that's from a single field in Saudi Arabia. The European Union, Europe is a bit bigger than we are in terms of economy, and let's see if we can find them on the map. Well, there's Norway. Looks pretty big compared to some of the other countries, and here they are with essentially no oil production. Totally dependent on liquid fuels from this part of the world. But even more alarming is looking over there at India and China. 1.3 billion people in China and 1 billion people in India. And look at the little bit of oil that they have. Here is India. Here is China. Wow, collectively they have about as much oil as less than the United States, because we've got a big chunk of our oil coming from Alaska up here. Recognizing this reality, the Chinese are now buying oil all over the world. Not only do they buy oil, they also buy goodwill. What do you need? A hospital, roads, a soccer stadium. And I asked the State Department, you know, we have only 2% of the oil in the world, and we are using 25% of the oil in the world. How come we aren't buying oil all over the world? Well, you don't really need to own the oil. It really makes very little difference who owns the oil, because the person who comes with the money, and it's dollars now, let's hope it stays dollars or we have a big problem, they go to the global oil auction and they buy oil at the going price. Today it was $103 a barrel. So I asked the State Department, why is China buying oil? And we're not buying any oil. And they said, well, we don't think China understands the marketplace. Well, at that time, I think China was growing at 16 or 18%. I think there's some at least presumptive indication that a country that's growing at 16, 18% kind of understands the marketplace. So why would China be buying oil? Let me suggest something. I hope I'm wrong. China has 900 million people that through the miracle of, in rural areas, that through the miracle of communications know the benefits of an industrialized society, and they're saying, hey guys, what about us? Because they are not sharing in the benefits of an industrialized society. If China can't bring some modicum of the benefits that accrue to a citizen in an industrialized society, they see perhaps their empire unraveling, much as the Soviet Empire unraveled, and so they are bending every effort to make sure that they have adequate resources for these 900 million people and the other 600 million people who are in urban areas. At the same time that China is buying up oil all over the world, they're very aggressively building a blue water navy. A brown water navy is what they're concerned about, is protecting their coast, will serve them quite well, by the way, and it is cheaper and more quickly developed. But they're very aggressively building a blue water navy and access denial technologies that will keep us away if they wish to. I hope the time doesn't come when the Chinese say, gee, I'm sorry, but it's our oil, and it will be their oil, they bought it, and we can't share it, because right now it doesn't matter who has the oil. It's shared in the global oil auction. Well, so this map indicates that the future is fraught with some possibilities of some pretty meaningful geopolitical tensions, and again I want to commend our military for their foresight, recognizing this reality and the reality that oil is $103 a barrel. And by the way, when oil goes up just $1 a barrel, it makes a big dent in what they can do. They can provide less health care, they can have less people, have less R&D, buy less platforms when oil goes up, because energy is a huge part of the cost of the military. So again, applaud to the military for their foresight and what they're doing. This is a chart that was predicted in 1956. Here we were, 1956 in the United States. At that time, we were the king of oil. We were pumping more oil, we were using more oil, we were exporting more oil than anybody else in the world. And Texas had a big chunk of that oil you see down here, and the rest of the United States here. On the 6th day of March, 1956, a oil geologist by the name of M. King Hubbert, and I've got his actual curve here in the next chart in just a moment, made a prediction that 1956, here we are, get the picture, the United States, king of oil, biggest producer, biggest consumer, and biggest exporter. And he is saying in 14 years, by about 1970, we're going to reach our maximum oil production, and no matter what we do after that, oil production is going to go down. How could he predict that? Well, what he had done was to notice the production and exhaustion of individual oil fields. By 1956, we'd had enough of those that he could see that there was a kind of a bell curve, up and then down, as you were developing, exploiting, and pumping those fields out. So he rationalized, gee, if I could add up all the little oil fields that we will have in our country, then I will get one big bell curve, and I can predict when it's going to peak. And he did that, and he said it's going to peak about 1970. And sure enough, right on target, it peaked in 1970. Now, we shortly found a huge amount of oil in Alaska. Oh, by the way, the top one here is natural gas liquids again, and we were just learning how to use those, and so they were a meaningful part of our energy availability. There was a little blip in the slide down the other side of Hubbard's Peak with this enormous supply of oil from Alaska for a while. I don't know exactly what it is today, but a fourth of all the oil production in our country came from Alaska. And then the fabled discoveries in the Gulf of Mexico, and we see them down here, and they hardly made a ripple in the slide down the other side of what's called Hubbard's Peak. Now here is a curve, a chart. This is the kind of a chart that a statistician, I guess, would use. And here we are, 1970, and Hubbard said we're going to be sliding down the other side. And Hubbard's Peak are the little triangles with yellow in them. The actual lower 48 production is the green, and the total production, adding in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, is the red. Of course, he didn't include Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. It was only the lower 48. And some might argue, a statistician might argue, that these two curves are different. I think the average citizen looking at it say, gee, M. King Hubbard got it about right, didn't he? The next chart is a very good prediction of where we are and the challenge, which is recognized by our military. This is where we get our energy from today. And this is 04. It hasn't changed a whole lot since 04. But coal, this much. Natural gas. Natural gas is going up a little now. That's getting bigger because it's now really cheap and it's pushing some coal out. And some people are afraid of nuclear. It may squeeze a bit of that out. Here's petroleum, about 40% of all of our energy. And here are renewables. Here are renewables. Now, as Hyman Rickover indicated, one day, these two things, renewables and nuclear, are going to fill this whole circle. It is inevitable. That's not tomorrow, by the way. And we are not running out of oil. We are not running out of oil. We have more oil to pump than all the oil that's been pumped in all the history of the world. What we're running out of is our ability to pump this oil as fast as we would like to use it. Well, here is a gross breakdown of the renewables. The solar, wow, look how small it is there. Wind is growing now, and these two things might be a bit bigger now if we updated this chart. But the important thing here to note is that hydroelectric, that's been there for a while. Biomass, and that's primarily burning waste in paper mills and things like that. Much of that is not new technology. Geothermal, that's true geothermal, tapping into the molten core of the earth. That could be bigger. It should be bigger. Whenever we can do that, we really need to take advantage of that. That's essentially an inexhaustible source of energy. But this shows us the challenge that we face. You know, we really are up to this challenge. And the part of this is green, and now people who are green focused say, gee, we need to be doing more of this for a couple of reasons. Some because they have a carbon footprint, and others because they say, gee, the fossil fuels just aren't going to be there. No matter what your premise is, the solution is exactly the same thing. So rather than criticizing each other's premise, I would hope we would lock arms and march forward to go to more renewables. Here's the last chart, because our time is about up today. And 5 years ago, I led a Codel to China. 9 of us went to China, and we spent about a week there, and we went there to talk about energy. And I was stunned. We all were stunned, because China began their discussion of energy by talking about post-oil. Wow. Of course there will be a post-oil world. Hyman Rickover predicted it. I think that almost anybody, you know, gee, everything is not oil out there. One day it will come to an end. China is looking, this is not tomorrow. This is probably 100, 150 years from now. So this is a really long-term policy. But everybody we talked to, it wasn't just the energy people, everybody we talked to talked about this post-oil strategy. And here's the 5 points. Here's the 5 points. Number one, conservation. The cheapest oil you will get is the oil you don't use. Number two, domestic sources of energy, and diversify those sources as much as you can. And number four will surprise you. Number four says be kind to the environment. They know they aren't, but they have these 900 billion people who are requiring the benefits of an industrialized society, so they're choking on a coal-fired power plant that they build one of each week, but they're building, I understand, 100 nuclear power plants, and I'm sure they will retire the coal-fired plants when they get there. The fifth point, and I will close with this and yield back my time, they are pleading for international cooperation. If you think about it for just a moment, we have a real problem here. If the United States really gets serious about conservation and efficiency in saving energy, and we better, and some will argue, wow, that will just empower the Chinese more, because then they're going to use that energy that we make more available and cheaper, and they're going to compete with us economically, and That's not a good thing. So from a selfish perspective, unless everybody does it, nobody's going to do it. Which is why the Chinese are pleading for international cooperation, because they know that it's not going to have as happy an ending if we don't have international cooperation. But while they plead for international cooperation, they have plan B. What if it doesn't happen? What if it doesn't happen? We buy up oil in the world, and then we have a Navy big enough to make sure that we have access to that oil in the world. We're the most innovative, creative society in the history of the world. And I can see America once again an exporting country, and it should be green technology. Much of what we're now importing from China and other places in the world, we created here. And then it migrated over there for production. That's why every 15 hours we have another $1 billion increase in the trade deficit. I want that thing reversed, and I think we can reverse that by recognizing that we have a huge challenge, following the lead of our military and going to